Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures weekly chart analysis for the week ending 7th of November 2025. The first chart is the US dollar index futures. They closed slightly lower this week. It was an attempt to move higher. It was a bit of a half-hearted attempt to move higher, which is suggested by the reduced and below average volume. And then price just settled back within the relative comfort found in the range of the previous bar, right up within its highs up here. So there was no serious attempt to move higher by all appearances. It was really a half-hearted attempt to move higher. I do expect there may be some more resistance as price pushes up to the more higher levels. There'll be some resistance up at this level, I expect. But the reduced and lower volume does suggest that there was no serious attempt to move higher this week. Price just floated up on a lack of selling pressure. It wasn't able to sustain a breakout above this bar's high. And it settled back down to close right in the top of the range of the previous up bar. Next chart is the E-mini S&P. This is S&P 500 index futures. Last week's bar did look suspiciously like a bit of a climactic bar. There's a little gap up. Volume increased and was above the average. Spread was relatively narrow and the close was poor down near the week's low. In response, prices pulled back. That was almost inevitable. There's going to be a test for supply at the very least. Prices pulled back with increased spread, but it did find sufficient buying support to close at this level here, which is a logical level for the market to attempt to find some support. Volume was reduced, but it remained about average, slightly above average, and there was a close off the week's low, which is showing you that there was some buying support in the market. So as price came down and it dipped below that important level, it did find some support, which is important at this point in time. I would expect in response there'll be a test for supply, at least early in the week. It'll look something like this. And then it will depend on how much supply is drawn out as to whether the market continues to push higher or whether the market pulls back further. I expect there will be some support found adjacent to this week's low through there. And it would really take increased weakness for the market to pull back to one of these levels below and test that for strength. This is US Treasury 10-year note futures. They did find a slight bid this week, albeit on quite low volume. You can see the volume down here was reduced and below the average. Spread was a little below the average itself, which makes sense considering that the volume was so low. Price dipped below the previous bar's low and found sufficient support to close back above it, or it actually floated back above it on a lack of selling pressure, would more likely describe what's happened. This wasn't a particularly strong move. This was a move derived mostly because selling pressure eased. I expect the market will trade around that level for some time. If price does push up, there's certain to be some sort of resistance up here. So you've got a nice range to work within there, which I expect the market will respect for some time. Overall, this market continues to trade within the range of this widespread down bar, which has done so for some time. There's been a pressing nature towards the upside moving through here, although more recently we have actually moved sideways a little. So it'll be interesting to see how this market contends next week. This is copper price futures. Copper price futures pulled back this week in response to the weakness that we saw emerge on this bar last week, which closed poorly as price attempted to break out on higher and above average volume. Prices pulled back as expected this week in response, and the volume reduced slightly below the average, which suggests that selling pressure eased as price came back, which is what you want to see when the market's responding to some weakness that's emerged. I expect a test for supply early next week, and then if supply is found to be low, an attempt to move up to the highs of the range there. Gold price futures. Gold price futures tested for supply within the range of the previous bar this week. It didn't threaten the previous bar's low at all. It traded just below the previous bar's close for much of the week, testing the market for supply, and the low volume suggests that supply or selling pressure was found to be low, and that allowed the market just to float up towards the end of the week to close as a slight up bar. Selling pressure definitely eased this week, and it would take further weakness to really challenge the lows here. Barring that, the most likely response is sideways if the market's not strong, or an attempt to move higher if there's a bid in the market and demand exceeds supply. This is the important level here. A clear break and close above that level would really be significant and would likely see this market really stretch higher again. So watch this level in here. It's just below 4,200. But there's no doubt that selling pressure eased this week. The low volume shows you that supply eased, and that's going to allow this market to move sideways for sure within the range of this bar. And if the low selling pressure remains, I expect price will push up to this important level here and may even challenge it if the market finds a bid. Silver price futures were similar in some respects to gold, as you'd expect. The market tested for supply for most of the week below the previous bar's close, and it traded as an inside bar, so you would expect reduced volume, but volume was very low, well below the average. That suggests that selling pressure has certainly eased in this market, and that will allow this market to push higher in response on any sort of bid. I don't expect weakness to emerge. It would take some real serious selling pressure now to overwhelm the buyers in the market. It's always possible. It's less likely at this point in time. The market's had a couple of cracks at moving lower, and sufficient buying support has come in both times to support the market. I expect this market will move sideways at worst, and there may be an attempt to move higher if selling pressure remains low. Like crude price futures, they moved lower this week and down to the highs of the previous range. Overall though, if you look at this up bar, it's a strong up bar on high volume, which emerged after there was a reluctance to move lower here, and prices really traded up high in the range of that up bar for the last 2 weeks in consolidation mode. That's actually pretty strong when you see an up bar like this and it consolidates right up in the highs of that bar's range, at least above the 50% level, then the market is relatively strong. And given a reasonable opportunity, this market will attempt to move higher in response. That's what you would expect. As soon as the period of consolidation concludes, if prices remain in consolidation mode above the 50% level, it'll usually make an attempt to move higher. Doesn't mean it'll be a successful attempt, but it will make an attempt to move higher. Into the currencies now. This is the euro-US dollar currency pair. It's traded the inverse of the US dollar, as you'd expect. Price did attempt to move lower. It did find a bid as the weakness in the US dollar moved price back, and it's closed right at this important level, which is exactly where you would expect it to find an attempt to support. Volume was low, well below the average, so this wasn't a particularly strong move. This was price just floating higher on a lack of selling pressure. We'll have a look at the pound. Pound's done a similar thing. It's, as you'd expect, it's moved lower initially, and volume was low, selling pressure was low, which allowed the market to float back up and close right at that important level. It's a logical level. It's where you would expect some support to be found. This market's a little weaker than the euro, which is kind of up at this level. But in a similar fashion, the market did push lower and then float higher on a lack of selling pressure. This is the Japanese yen currency futures. They did make an attempt to recover, as we expected they probably would, in response to the previous week's bar, which is threatening to break down. This market wasn't strong enough to move back above this level here, the lows of the range. There's been an attempt to consolidate and hold on, but it's been a weak attempt. Volume was low and below the average. There wasn't really a bid there. If this market was going to hold on, it would have pushed back up and moved above this level this week. It may still do so. It's less likely now. And the lows of that bar, if they're exceeded towards the downside, you'll confirm a breakdown here. We'll have to go looking for support because we don't have an obvious level in the immediate background. So we'll have a look and see where the price might go in response. It certainly looks like the market will go lower here at this point in time. You really would have expected the market to push above this level this week. Aussie dollar currency futures, and they pulled back as expected this week after the inferred weakness was drawn out here. Price came back. We were expecting a test for supply. At the very least, the price did come back. It found some support at this intermediate level within the range, closing just a little off its lows on reduced and below average volume. So price has come back. It hasn't found a great deal of selling pressure, and that's allowed enough support to come in to find the market holding on to this intermediate level within the range. You may see a test for supply early next week in response, and if supply is found to be low, the market may push up towards the highs of the range again. This is Bitcoin futures. Bitcoin futures did not make an attempt to move higher this week, or there was only a very brief attempt to move higher this week. Price pulled back. Volume was actually reduced and well below the average, so it wasn't a strong pullback, and that's probably why the market did find a bid and close well off its lows for the week. Price pulled back and it found support at this level, which is a logical level for the market to find some support. You really would expect this market to respond and move higher following this sort of bar. Volume was low, so selling pressure was low as price pulled back. There was sufficient bid for the market to close off its weekly low. That being said, we expected the market to successfully push higher following this bar. It didn't do so. It consolidated. It did find a bid last week, and I expect that the market would push up to the highs of this range last week. It didn't do so. Price pulled back once again, so it hasn't really traded as expected at this point in time. So just be careful here. If price does continue lower, this is the next important level below, which is a fair way down. I expect there'll be an attempt to hold on at this level through here prior to actually breaking down, but a clear break and close below this week's low here will almost certainly see the market come down and test this level for strength. So I expect the market will try to hold on at this level, hold on at that dotted line there, and consolidate for a week or even two and generate some further buying support, or at least attempt to. If there is a bid in the market, I expect price will move up to this level, this dashed line through there. Okay, just back to the US dollar index futures quickly to finish up. The market did make an attempt to move higher. It was a bit of a half-hearted attempt to move higher on reduced and below average volume. That's really going to be strong enough to support a push higher, especially one where the market needs to move above an important level with a secondary level just above that. So the market's gone up. It's given that little area a test, see how strong it is, and then it's pulled back. The volume suggests that it wasn't particularly strong above, and given any sort of decent bid, this market should be able to push up to that level where I expect there will be further resistance found. If supply is drawn out, the market will move back and probably come to this level where it's been previously and found support. So it's all pretty logical there. It'll just depend how much selling pressure is in the market in particular. Okay, thanks for your time. Back again next week. See ya.